Welcome to 'Cause We're Nerds, the podcast that covers trends and new releases in comic books, movies, video games, board games, and much more. I'm your host, Zach, and with me is my co-host and cousin, Caleb.
Hey everyone.
Thanks for joining us on our current series, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, where we will be discussing each MCU movie in release order, all leading up to Marvel's Avengers Infinity War this May. Thor is back and more beautiful than ever. In his second solo installment, did Chris Hemsworth's story arc keep the Norse god fresh? After the events in Avengers, how was the god of mischief, Loki, handled? And how was it that before directing a DC female god, Patty Jenkins almost directed the God of Thunder? Find out these questions and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds. Road to Marvel's Infinity War. Thor, the Dark World. So Caleb, we are now into our second movie of Phase 2, with Thor the Dark World being the 8th movie, and with 10 left to go, we are almost halfway through. How is your Marvel experience? Do you have any fatigue yet?
No, I'm going strong, and I'm actually really happy that we're doing this, Zach.
Yeah, this is really exciting, especially since just a few days ago, Marvel released in social media the fact that it has been now 10 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Some great videos and images. If you have time, we would highly suggest you go check that out.
Yeah, and we keep talking about this being the lead up to Avengers Infinity War, but it's also a celebration of Marvel's 10th anniversary itself.
That's right. So with Thor the Dark World being the second installment for Chris Hemsworth, this is also the second movie in Phase 2. For those listeners who might not be aware, Caleb, why don't you walk through the phases for us?
So, phases are a way for the fans and Marvel themselves to kind of separate the movies into manageable chunks so that when we're talking about different groups, we know what we're talking about. It came about in an interview with Kevin Feige. It was kind of an accident, and he referred to some movies as Phase 1. So what this means is, basically, the Avengers are divider movies. So Iron Man up through Avengers 1 is Phase 1. Iron Man 3 through Avengers 2, and also including Ant-Man, for some reason, is Phase 2. Anything after that is Phase 3, which is what we're experiencing right now. And I'm assuming, Zach, that Avengers 4 will also be a part of Phase 3, since it's kind of a two-part with Avengers 3, which is Infinity War.
Yeah, I'd assume you'd correct on that. And so with our Christmas but not Christmas movie of Iron Man 3 releasing in May of 2013, 6 months later we get our second Thor movie releasing in November of 2013. And we also get a new director, Alan Taylor. Now, from my research, I saw that Alan Taylor is mainly a TV director before this movie. I saw he had done some stints on Mad Men, Law and Order, and The Sopranos.
Yeah, the director role for this movie has kind of had a rocky road, Zach. Marvel announced the release date of this film as July 26, 2013, way back in 2011. At the same time, they announced that Kenneth Branagh would not return. They didn't have any hard feelings with each other, but Branagh did not want to rush into another big movie because they take so long to make, and that's not really his forte. In August of 2011, a guy named Brian Kirk was in talks to direct this. He had also done a lot of medieval stuff and a lot of HBO stuff, which lends itself to Thor, but they couldn't work out a contract. The next big person that came along was Patty Jenkins. Recognize that name?
I do, from Wonder Woman.
Yeah, she ended up going to DC and doing Wonder Woman. And she wasn't just in talks for this movie, she was actually confirmed to direct in October of 2011. After she came on board, Marvel moved the release date a couple months, but then she departed in December. So she was only on this movie for about 2 months.
So what's the reason for Patty Jenkins to depart? Because that would have been a very interesting take on Thor.
Well, from what I could find, they cited, as they often do, creative differences, right? And they said it was very amicable. But that was Marvel's side. There are other reports, unconfirmed, that she was fired outright without any warning. So we don't really know the specifics, but what we do know is that she wanted to do a sort of Romeo and Juliet story with Thor and Jane.
Okay, so maybe not as interesting as I thought it would have been for Thor. Now, these creative differences, was that creative differences with Kevin Feige, with somebody else in the Marvel business sector?
It's always hard to tell. Kevin Feige is the head of Marvel Studios, so I'm assuming that they would be differences with him since he pretty much has final say, but I don't know for sure. Just 3 days after her departure, though, 2 more directors were reported as being in talks. So Alan Taylor and Daniel Minahan, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, were both in talks. They'd both done a lot of HBO stuff, and Showtime and some other stuff like Deadwood, The Newsroom, Game of Thrones. And Alan Taylor specifically had done a lot of Game of Thrones and The West Wing. And he also had 3 movies up until that point, all of which were fairly old at that point. One in 95, one in 2001, and another one in 2003. None of which are movies that I recognize the name of.
Yeah, the only exposure of Alan Taylor that I had up to this point, and I had to do research to even see that he was the one filming these, was that, as you mentioned, he directed a couple of Game of Thrones. He directed 4 episodes in season 2, as well as he directed Beyond the Wall in season 7, which would have obviously came out after Thor the Dark World.
So Alan Taylor was actually chosen to direct this film, finalized in December of 2011. Now, you mentioned that you knew him from some Game of Thrones stuff. Were you excited for him as the director?
I only knew him through my research actually for this movie and this podcast. So going into Thor the Dark World, I didn't know he was necessarily the director. And as I mentioned in my previous podcast, I hadn't even seen this movie until 7 months ago.
Oh, good point. I had not seen Game of Thrones at that point myself, but I was excited because I knew the production quality of Game of Thrones, and it is very similar to kind of what a Thor movie is, or should be, or could be. And so I was excited for him in that respect.
Well, not only do we have a new director here, but we also have a new character and a recasting of an old character.
Yes, Christopher Eccleston as the villain Malekith. So Mads Mikkelsen was actually in talks to play this character. He ended up not being able to do that because of other commitments. We will see him later as a different villain in the Doctor Strange movie. But the title did go to Christopher Eccleston, who, I don't know if you're aware of this, Zach, was the 9th Doctor in Doctor Who.
I looked up his filmography and I saw that he had played some stints in Doctor Who. Other than that, I hadn't heard of him, and I don't even watch Doctor Who, so I had no idea who this guy was.
Well, me and my wife are really big Doctor Who fans, so I hadn't seen his run at that point, so I was cautiously optimistic. But since then, David Tennant, who is the 10th Doctor, has been in a Marvel property, being Jessica Jones Season 1 as the Purple Man. And so I'm just waiting for the 11th Doctor, Matt Smith, to jump in and join the MCU as well.
Now, while I wasn't familiar with Christopher Eccleston, I was familiar with Zachary Levi, mainly through his show Chuck. Did you watch that?
I have never seen Chuck.
Well, I'm sure you'll see his next movie that he'll appear in, Shazam, correct?
Yeah, he's jumping companies like a lot of people are now. But he came in to replace Joshua Dallas as Fandral. Joshua had to bow out due to some commitments on Once Upon a Time, which is a show he was on at the time. And Levi came in, and Levi was actually up for the role in the first movie, but had to bow out due to his commitments to Chuck. So it's kind of a funny back and forth swap they did here.
Now, Fandral is part of the Warriors 3. He's the Robin Hood looking character.
Correct.
And Caleb, I will be completely honest. I had no idea he was different until the credits started rolling, and it was like Zachary Levi as Fandral. I'm like, wait, what? I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that's the same character as he was for Thor 1, and I had to research it. I'm like, oh, it wasn't.
Yeah, because Fandral didn't have a big role in the first movie, it's really easy to not realize this is a different guy. I knew simply because I'm into all the behind-the-scenes stuff, and so I knew when it was announced, but he looks very similar. If you actually put them side by side, though, you can definitely tell a difference, but because, like I said, not a big role, not a big deal.
And when he first pops up after this opening scene, I think they could basically be the same character. Nobody would necessarily notice.
I agree. So, Zach, we talked about a little bit in our Phase 1 podcast about Joss Whedon and his role. After Avengers came out, he was hired on to direct the sequel to the Avengers, but also oversee all of Marvel's Phase 2 movies. And so he actually had a lot of input on this movie. Apparently there were some scenes that they were trying to do that just weren't working, and they kind of overnighted him on a plane to come over and fix those scenes. And then when he left, they were perfect. And he kind of put this movie on the right path from the writing perspective.
And Caleb, I did some research, and I know exactly the scenes you were talking about. And when Thor first appears, if you really look at his costume, you will notice that his hair is slightly longer. You can credit that to Kevin Feige, who whipped out Thor 344, showed it to the hairstylist, and of course, changed the hair. No, I'm just kidding about all that. I have no idea.
Yeah, but you're right, his hair is longer, and as with all these Thor movies, the character's hair gets longer. His hair is longer, Loki's hair is longer, but we'll see that more once we get into the film itself.
And I think Kevin Feige, now that we're entered phase 2 with 8 movies after Thor the Dark World, has to have this creative control to make sure that they are all aligned with the MCU.
And that's interesting you say that, Zach, because while he is doing that and he's definitely steering the ship, all of these phase 2 movies feel very different from their phase 1 counterparts.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you there.
All right, Zach, should we get into the film?
We should.
Long ago, an ancient race known as the Dark Elves waged war on the 9 realms. Asgard defeated them and buried their ultimate weapon, the Ether. Years later, the Dark Elves and their leader Malekith awaken and promise to wage war once again. With Asgard facing its darkest hour, Thor must form an uneasy alliance with his brother Loki before the universe is thrust into eternal darkness.
And so before we even get the opening scene, we encounter something completely new to the MCU movies.
Yeah, Marvel has a new logo this time. Zach, what did you think of this? Did you even notice it had changed?
You know, I'm so used to the logo that they have now, I didn't really notice it, to be honest.
So when I saw this for the first time, I remember being very surprised by this logo, because Marvel had the page flipping stuff for the better part of a decade, actually. I think that came around with that very first Spider-Man movie, which was around 2001, 2002. So it was a big deal for them to kind of go away from that.
I like this new logo, though.
It's not the logo they're using currently, but it's definitely a step up from what they had originally.
Well, this opening scene is almost a recreation of what we get in Thor. We have a narration done by, I believe it's Odin, and there's a backstory here where we get of Malekith, the Dark Elves, and the Ether, and it's this very Lord of the Rings-esque opening, which is kind of like what we saw in the beginning of Thor, and I loved it.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Zach. This is very reminiscent of the first film. And watching this now with the knowledge of what's in Ragnarok, this all kind of goes into Odin's conquest that they talk about in that film.
Now, we get introduced to the villain, Malekith. Were you aware of who Malekith was before this movie?
Not aside from things that I had seen because he was being the villain in this film. I knew he was a Thor villain. I knew he was a Dark Elf. But that's the extent of it.
I'm on the same page with you. However, if you look in the comics, Malekith first appears in Thor 344, and he was created by the artist and penciler Walt Simpson. So in Simpson's story arc, Malekith is actually after the Casket of Ancient Winters, which you might be aware was in our first Thor movie. And kind of in this story arc of where he was created, he gets it, he releases it upon the Earth, and then Thor, a cast of Marvel superheroes, and Thor's brother, Loki, have to stop Malekith, which is an interesting tie-in into this movie as the same happens.
So, Zach, what do you think of his design in this film? I know what he looks like in the comics, and it is very bright and kind of out there like Thor's original costume is, but they definitely updated it for the film.
Yeah, in the comics, bright costume, I believe it's like red, and it has some type of symbol or star in the middle of it. And his hair is at some times like an afro, and at other times long, stringy red hair. I love this updated version of the villain. I mean, the Dark Elves themselves all look great, I think. I mean, it's a normal kind of action villain, and I think it fits. What did you think?
I think they did a pretty good job translating him. I just wish that maybe he stood out from the other Dark Elves a little bit more. If you look on his chest, he still has that star symbol you're talking about. And in the comics, his body is like two-toned, like Two-Face or something. And he does eventually get that in this film. So I think they did a good job, but I wish, a little bit more.
And the Dark Elves, interestingly enough, also spring up in the comics, but not enough to really warrant how they're tied into Thor the Dark World. I think that's more taken off in Norse mythology, where the Dark Elves, I believe they're called the Dokalfar. I'm not exactly sure, so don't quote me. But they're basically contrasted to Light Elves. So you have Light Elves who live on Earth, and then these Dark Elves. Very 13th century dark and light idea.
And Zach, looking back on this movie, these ship designs remind me a lot of the ships in Guardians of the Galaxy, especially Ronin's giant ship, with the way it's got those kind of plates, it looks like, that are kind of turned. And I thought that was a really cool tie-in that was something that, probably wasn't on purpose, but just a byproduct of having the same graphic designers and conceptual artists on the films.
And I never connected that until now, but you're right. That's actually a really cool tie-in.
And Zach, I'm just going to let the cat out of the bag now. My feelings when this film came out were terrible. This was my least favorite Marvel movie, and I never wanted to see it again. Recently, I thought, maybe I should rewatch it to see if it's actually as bad as I thought it was. And we will talk about what I think this time. But as I was sitting through this opening scene, my thoughts were, wow, this is actually a really good opening, and they didn't mess it up here at the beginning.
Yeah, this is a very enjoyable opening, and I believe a very enjoyable rest of the movie. Sure, there's some CGI-ish aspects of this opening, but overall, great opening to the movie.
So from here, we jump to modern day Asgard, and we get something that we have never really seen before in that first movie or the Avengers, which is the ground level of Asgard, right? We see actual citizens walking around. It feels like a real place. It's kind of dirty. It's weathered. It looks more like it was inspired by Norse design rather than this kind of futuristic golden city that it was in the first movie. And this was a deliberate decision by Alan Taylor when he came in to do the film.
And it's during this scene that we get a short encounter, but important encounter, between Loki and Odin. So this is the first time that we see Loki returning after he was captured by Thor and the rest of the Avengers, after that Avengers movie. I love the acting here by Tom Hiddleston. What did you think of the interaction between Odin and Loki?
Oh, boy. Well, some concern about Odin in the films is he's too harsh. And I definitely feel that here. He is very harsh, but I feel like it's deserved as well. I mean, Loki has gone off and conquested Earth to try to rule it. Now, contrasting that with what we see Odin has done in Thor Ragnarok, it's a little hard to swallow. But without that knowledge in this film, I think it's very warranted.
And remember, the last scene that we saw in Thor between Loki and Odin was harsh. He's like, you're not really my son. I don't care what you do, remember? And that's why Loki let go of the staff. I can't remember what he let go of, but he let go of something and fell into the black hole. So I thought this was very reminiscent of Thor and of Loki's new story arc going into Thor the Dark World.
And I think that it's important to have this scene. I think it would have been a missed opportunity if they did not do it. So I'm glad that it's here to see the fallout of what he did in the Avengers. And it almost acts like kind of a trilogy of Loki, right? You have Thor as the story beginning, you have the Avengers as the middle part, and you have this movie as the conclusion to his story arc.
So with Loki getting locked up for the majority of this movie, we jump to Vanaheim. I
think it's Vanaheim.
So we jump to Vanaheim, where we see that Thor, the Warriors 3, and Sif are all fighting. Well, who are they fighting?
They're called the Marauders in all of the extra features. These are basically random aliens from across the 9 realms that have started pillaging villages and cities because the Bifrost, when it was destroyed in the first movie, basically cut off Asgard from the rest of the world.
And this is actually an Easter egg. Are you familiar with the Marauders in the comic books?
No, I have no idea who they are.
So in the comics, the Marauders are mutant assassins, so they're very heavily tied in with X-Men. Unfortunately, because 20th Century Fox owns all of that, they have to basically change the backstory of the Marauders. So here in the MCU, the Marauders, like you said, are a ragtag bunch of invaders that go around the Nine Realms destroying, looting, pillaging, etc. But they actually do have a very heavy influence in the comics. It's just a lot different.
And we find out that this is where, jumping ahead a bit, we find out that this is where Hogan is from. Is this correct as with the comics? Do you know?
Are you talking about like Hulk Hogan?
No, Hogan from the Warriors 3.
Oh, I am unfamiliar actually with the Warriors 3. I decided not to do research on them because I didn't want to tear my eyeballs out of boredom.
Well, anyway, this is his homeworld that they're saving here. And Thor comes in and he's gotten a costume change.
That's right. We mentioned in the opening he has longer hair, but he has several different other aspects that are changed in his armor.
That's right. His armor is very much more real. It feels more real. It's made out of more leather. And this actually takes some inspiration from some different runs in the Thor comics to bring this more to a grounded level to match that Asgardian look that Alan Taylor wanted to bring.
And it's during this fight scene that the Marauders call in their biggest fighter, who we find out is a Cronin. Now, if you remember mentioning this in Thor, Thor's first issue is Journey into Mystery, issue 83, where we see these rock creatures. And so that's like the first appearance of them. And in that issue, they're seen as stonemen from Saturn, which we later find out they're called Cronins. Now, we actually later will see another Cronin in Thor number 3 named Korg that makes his comic appearance in Planet Hulk.
So after they take care of this area, it jumps back to Asgard, and we get more of those shots of the ground level. And we see a raven flying in down to Odin, which again is a reference to those same ravens we've talked about so many times.
Now, which raven was this? Was it Hugin or Munnin?
I don't know, Zach.
I don't know either. Flip a coin.
But we also see that they've rebuilt the Bifrost without any explanation.
Yeah, that was my first question when we saw Thor land and help out the Warriors 3. I'm like, wait, is Odin using dark magic like he was using in the Avengers? But then when we jump back to Asgard, we see that the Bifrost is rebuilt, even though it was clearly stated by Odin and Thor in our first Thor movie that the Bifrost cannot be rebuilt.
I don't remember them saying that, Zach. Are you sure?
100% positive that I'm not sure that is what they said. But it was alluded to that the Bifrost, once destroyed, would either be like there's no way to then transport yourself off-world. So I'm not really sure how it was necessarily rebuilt.
Yeah, it's definitely alluded to, if not said outright. But I don't know if you noticed, Zach, this is not exactly the same Bifrost that we got in the first film. It's very similar, but there are certain design changes around it that make it look different. For example, like you can see through it during some angles, right to the inside. And the inside kind of gear-looking things move in this film. I don't remember them moving in the first one.
Well, in each Thor movie, we actually get a different Bifrost.
And that makes sense, as they do with all their characters. They want to evolve the world and make it feel exciting and new. Now, Thor comes in and he talks to Odin, and he basically says that they've calmed the attacks, and he specifically calls out 2 places. He says that they've secured Nornheim and Raya. Now, Zach, are you familiar with either of these places?
I am not.
So, Nornheim, in the comics, is where the Norns live. The Norns are like the fates in Greek mythology. They kind of oversee people's fates, right? And it's unclear exactly where this is in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but in the comics, it's on the same landmass as Asgard, but it's considered separate from Asgard. Now, the Norns kind of come back again in Avengers Age of Ultron. There's this weird scene where Thor goes and takes a bath, right? And he starts talking. That was actually a longer sequence that had to be cut down because the Marvel executives told Joss it had to be. But the Norns are possessing Thor, and that's why he says those things in that film. So Raya is the homeworld of the Cronins that you just mentioned, Korg and this guy at the beginning of the film, which we actually get a shot of very briefly in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, when Rocket and Yondu are on their way to Ego.
Now we also get a scene here between Odin, Thor, and Sif. Odin basically alludes that Thor needs to stop moping around about how he'll never see Jane Foster again, and instead, Thor should have his eye on... Got him! I'm just waiting to receive hate mail.
So Odin wants Thor to go after Sif, basically, and this is another Easter egg regarding to the comics, right? Because in the comics, Thor and Sif actually marry at some point, I believe. If not marry, they're definitely a couple
Yes.
that they are for a long time. And Odin actually arranged that particular meeting where they started to have an interest in each other in the comics. And side note, also in the comics, Heimdall is Sif's brother.
I did not know that.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of characters in the comics that don't have the same familiar relationships as they do in the films. For example, Thor actually has several other brothers in the comics that either do not exist in the film universe yet, or exist, but they're not related at all.
Yeah, and I believe this does set up a really good side story. Jane Foster and Thor's relationship work really well for me here, and Sif and Thor's kind of semi-relationship that, they could get together, Sif wants to, but Thor doesn't, also work. Now, both of those don't necessarily pay off in Thor 3, as both characters don't return. Thor does, but not Sif or Jane Foster, but it still works in Thor 2. Now, after this, we jump to London, where, to put it in Darcy's words, Eric went banana balls. And it's through a TV screen we see that Eric Solveig has stripped clothes and is running around... Well, where's he running around again?
Stonehenge.
Stonehenge, that's right. Butt naked, waving his contraptions. Caleb, does the movie ever explain why Eric went banana balls?
Yes, there is a throwaway line later in the movie where he says he's gone crazy because he's had a god in his brain. And what he's alluding to is when Loki came down and took him over, that made him go crazy. I'm not sure why he went crazy and Hawkeye didn't. Maybe Hawkeye has more fortitude, but for whatever reason, he's cuckoo now.
That makes a lot more sense. Now, after Darcy reveals this information to Jane, she also reveals that their devices have gone haywire. That after the events in the Avengers movie, Jane Foster and Darcy have both moved to London. Jane Foster's living in her mom's basement, basically, and starting to redate gentlemen. But the devices that they have now are sort of malfunctioning. So is this indicating that they moved to England to get some type of coordinates to track down Thor?
I think it's explained at some point that there were some anomalies that they'd been following. We do find out that she has been pining over Thor for the past 2 years, which, girl, get over it. It's been 2 years. You haven't even seen him. When you saw him on TV, he didn't even come and see you. So, anyway, they're here for basically the same thing that they were in New Mexico for. But while they're here, they get readings that were very similar to the Bifrost readings they got when Thor came down.
So Jane Foster, Darcy, and we'll just call him the intern, head to a kind of rundown building and complex where they find some abnormalities have been happening here with the ether. Now, my question along this strains are, how has this ether awakened? Because it's kind of in this scene that they start playing with these abnormalities. They see that there are some basically transporting mechanisms that are happening, and then Jane Foster wanders off and touches the ether. Like, where did this come from? Has it always been in place, or has it awakened?
So, Zach, there's a couple things going on here. First, and it's confusing the way this movie handles it, but if you follow the through lines in the film, this is not caused by the ether. These abnormalities are being caused by the convergence, which we haven't talked about yet, but is basically where the 9 realms come into alignment every 5,000 years, and the lines between them start to blur. So that's why we're getting the gravity abnormalities and the portals that go through. Now, Jane does stumble upon the ether, which I was wondering where it was. There's a line later that tells us this is in Svartalheim, which is the Dark World, the title of this movie, which is also where the Dark Elves are from. That is, as far as I can tell, just a coincidence that that's where she ends up.
That makes sense. So she ends up there, she touches the ether, and we kind of find out then that the ether is absorbed into her body, and that she was knocked out for, I believe, 5 or 6 hours.
Yeah, and then she suddenly reappears. There's some dialogue. The police are there, but Thor comes down to rescue her because I believe Heimdall has told him what's going on with her.
Yeah, and while Heimdall and Thor are talking, we do get a glimpse that answers a question we had in Thor. In Thor, we were wondering about the 9 realms, but how that fits into this universe. Heimdall basically explains to Thor, and it's explained a little later on as well, that these 9 realms, I believe, are simply 9 worlds. So it's 9 planets. So the realms that Asgard controls aren't necessarily realms, but planets.
Yeah, I guess you're right. It's still a little bit vague, but I think it has to be, otherwise it's too confusing.
We also get an interesting remark by Jane who was yelling at Darcy and can't believe that she called the cops, because she said if you call the cops, they get the feds. If you call the feds, they bring S.H.I.E.L.D., which is an interesting kind of progression, but I guess would answer our questions from Iron Man 3 on why S.H.I.E.L.D. wasn't at Tony Stark's house, because there's a progression in the chain of command.
And so following this scene where Thor apparently takes her back, we get our first shot at the Dark Elves' ship. And it's just in space. And now, Zach, for me, this was really cool because in the Thor movies, while we've seen them kind of travel through space with the Bifrost, we've never actually seen like proper space. And I thought this looked really cool. And to me, when we get to the inside of the ship, I thought the design was very much inspired by the Alien movie way back in the day. And looks very much like that.
Yeah, I love the design. For me, it felt not necessarily like Alien, but it felt like Star Trek, specifically the reboot with Chris Pine.
And actually, this film has a very large Star Wars feel as well at different points throughout it. And so I think all of those were very clear influences. Now, we see in here with some dialogue, they do say what you mentioned earlier, that the ether has awakened and it has awakened them. Now, Zach, I gotta give props to my wife because she pointed this out and it makes a lot of sense. I asked in our Avengers episode if the Tesseract can go dormant because they say that it's awoken, right? In this film, they say the exact same thing about the ether, which we will find out through later movies, or actually at the end of this movie, that it is also an Infinity Stone. So it does appear that these things can go dormant. And that would explain why Thanos doesn't have them and why he hasn't gone after them up until this point.
You go, Courtney. You go. We also get an interesting scene where Algrim, who's been Malekith's partner, is turned into Curse. Now, before I talk about the backstory of the comics, Curse, that power that he has, is this the same power that the Dark Elves, or a couple of the Dark Elves, had in the opening scene, where they crushed the Red Stone and transformed into these beasts?
Yeah, I think it is. We see that Algrim doesn't just transform. He actually gets one of those things like stuffed into his body. They cut him open and put it in there so that it's hidden because he's going to eventually get himself captured by Asgard. But yes, it's the same thing.
Now, what's interesting is that he appears in issue 347 of Thor, which is just 4 issues after Malekith appears. So in the comics, they're actually tied together like in the movies. But Malekith opens up this like molten magma land and tries to make Thor basically fall into it. Unfortunately, he actually makes Algrim fall into it, and Algrim kind of hates Malekith after that. To cut a long story short, he hunts down Thor, fights Beta Ray Bill, fights Thor. Thor and Beta Ray Bill kill him, basically knock him out, send him to hell, not Hell, Hel, which I'll talk about later. And then Curse goes through hell, finds Malekith, and kills Malekith. So it's like, it's really interesting. I think that takes like 10 comics to actually all flush out. But they are linked in the comics. It's just that they first are partners and then one kills the other. So after this brief scene, we jump to Asgard, where Jane has now been whisked away by Chris Hemsworth and finds herself amongst the gods.
And we get a few scenes of her kind of acclimating to this and them studying the ether that's inside of her, and Odin doesn't like it, and Thor's there to protect her, and all this drama stuff. But we quickly get whisked into Odin's, like, library, it looks like. And I think I mentioned in an earlier podcast that we see, it's actually pronounced Yggdrasil, the tree of life that flows throughout the universe, that we see in this film. It's not actually the tree. I was wrong. This is more like a diagram. But it is magically linked to the real tree, and supposedly the branches will fall off when Ragnarok starts happening, and those areas are affected. But it's here that we learn a bunch of backstory about Malekith, and they say something that, Zach, doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and that is that Malekith created the ether.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense, Caleb.
So this is basically a whole bunch of exposition, but Odin explains that he calls them the relics, normally appear as stones, and what he's talking about are the Infinity Stones. But because this doesn't make sense because of a later movie, Guardians, right?
Correct.
We get another scene in Guardians of the Galaxy where the Collector explains where these came from. And he says that 4 cosmic beings, known as the cosmic entities, forged, quote, energies of singularities into 6 powerful objects, end quote. And that all predates the universe. So I'm assuming that Odin is misinformed, that Malekith created it, and that he simply took it to use for himself. Now that would make sense because, as we saw in the opening, Odin's not around yet. It's his father that's actually fighting them, Bor.
And this misinformation, I think, would fit into the lineage and history of Asgard. As we'll find out in Thor 3, a lot of that has been changed to save face. So we don't know what Thor's father has done to also change and save face, or that could just be simply misinformation.
And so with this, in a couple scenes, we see that Malekith has tracked down the ether. They'd made a quick pit stop by their homeworld to pick it up, and it's not there, and so they find it in Asgard.
And can I just say that Heimdall here is so cool. And so we find out that Malekith's ship can basically turn invisible, but nothing is invisible to Heimdall, who runs across the Bifrost, jumps on one of the ships, and destroys it, before you find out that there actually is a whole fleet of other ships, and it wasn't the big one that he destroyed, it was just a little piloting craft.
Yeah, it appears that he can't see these from a distance, but when they're close enough, he can feel them. I don't know, maybe it's like wind going by you when someone runs, but that's how he finds out, and it leads into this massive attack on Asgard with these ships that, to me, look like B-Wings from Star Wars. Mm-hmm. This is where I got a very big Star Wars vibe, Zach.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with the aesthetics of how the ships look. Now, before this attack happens, I do have a question for you, Caleb.
What's that?
So we see that Curse has been able to join the Warriors Free and the Marauders as a captured Marauder. How did Malekith send Curse into that area to be captured when this happens a little later in the movie and the Warriors 3 and Sif are kind of already back into Asgard?
Well, I don't know if the Warriors 3 are actually the ones that brought him back. Maybe they came back from some other soldiers, or maybe the Warriors 3 did not return with Thor, and they were still out somewhere else fighting. I'm not sure it's really answered.
And I don't think it necessarily needs to matter. What does matter is that Curse ends up in the prison, where we also have a confrontation between Loki and his mother. Now, I thought this was kind of interesting. Again, this happens a little bit before the attack, but it establishes that while Loki's father, Odin, has shunned him, he still has a good relationship with his mom.
Yeah, and we find out through this scene and through the rest of the movie that she's actually the one that has taught him to do this magic and have kind of encouraged his trickery.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting part of this film.
And I think it's also very touching. He reaches out to kind of grab her hand, and she's not actually there. She's using the projection.
That's right. You know, Tom Hiddleston's acting in this is great, and I love the story arc that they have Loki on in this film, and it works really well, and I think it fits much better than how they portrayed him in the Avengers, which, if you've listened to that podcast, I had a lot of gripes about. We see the Marauders one more time in this prison with Algrim, who... he's cursed, but he hasn't turned into curse, but it's here that he does turn into curse. So as Caleb, you talked about, he takes off the stone that was hidden inside his stomach because instead of just like swallowing it or something, he decided to cut a hole open in himself. And he takes it out, crushes it, kills all the Marauders that are in his cell with him, breaks out, and then breaks a ton of the other prisoners. So, the plan here, I thought, was excellent. Incite a riot in the prisons, while you have a bunch of the planes trying to hit the Tower of Asgard itself, and then have Curse go take down the shields that are within the tower.
And we do see that Heimdall is the one that activates the shields, which is interesting because he's at the Bifrost and they activate around the, I guess, castle that Odin is in. And they do take it down really quickly, and there's a bunch of fights here. And Zach, I think all this stuff is very interesting. But really the only important thing that happens here is when Algrim escapes, when Curse escapes, Loki tells him to go up a certain stairway, and he does go up there, and he finds Malekith there, who's fighting Frigga, who is Thor's mother. I'm not sure if we actually mentioned her very much in the first movie. She doesn't have a big role there. And she's not in this movie much, but her role is much larger because during this fight, she dies.
That's right. So she is in her throne room with Jane Foster trying to protect her. And both Odin and Thor realize that that is where Curse most likely is, as well as Malekith. And so they both run up to save her. Unfortunately, they're a little too late. Thor does scar Malekith with lightning and I believe hits Curse with his hammer. But they are able to jump off the building, land on a plane, and escape with Frigga dead, but Jane Foster still alive. What did you think of Frigga's death here? Was it justified? Was it impactful at all? Or was it simply kind of an action movie where you went, oh, they killed off the character?
I think for me, it was a little bit more impactful just because I know kind of a little bit more of the backstory of it. In the film itself, it works, but it would have worked much better if we got to see her more in the first movie. It works to kind of incite Thor and his quest that he ends up going in this film. But I do wish that we would have seen more of her, especially since she's one of the few deaths that have actually stayed dead in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
I would agree with you. What I think works really well here is the music. Were you able to listen to that music? It was such a well-composed music that really pulled on your heartstrings.
And one thing I found beautiful, Zach, is following the scene and a couple other scenes, we get to see her funeral. And it is kind of like a traditional Norse Viking funeral where they put her on this boat, they send her off, and then they fire those arrows that are on fire. And this entire scene is beautiful. I think it might be one of my favorite shots and scenes in the entirety of the MCU.
Yeah, very Lord of the Rings-esque style. Other than Agent Coulson, I would say this is definitely one of the most impactful deaths. Even though we don't really know Frigga, it's still impactful because of the time they spent on it and how they try to pull our heartstrings with the music, as well as the shots that you talked about, Caleb.
Now, following this very touching scene, we do go back to London, and here's where we get our Stan Lee cameo.
That's right. So Dr. Selvig is now in a sane asylum or an old person's home. I don't really know which one. Was it clear to you?
I think it's a retirement home, but no, it's not 100%.
And so he's talking about the ether, about the convergence, and he borrows some shoes, and then the camera kind of flips from him to the audience. And that's where it's revealed that he might be in a retirement home, and one of those retirees is Stan Lee, who looks up from his game and says, "Can I have my shoe back?"
Yeah, I don't think it's one of his best ones, but it's always good to see the man.
Now, we also get a few Easter eggs. Were you familiar with what was written on the chalkboard behind Eric?
Zach, I kind of think of this chalkboard as I think of the collector's room in Guardians of the Galaxy. There's a ton of stuff in there, and I know there's a ton of stuff, but it's just too much for me to try to decipher.
That's right. I wasn't able to catch everything, but I did catch two important parts. The first one was there was the word "the fault" written on it. Now, the fault, if you're familiar with the comics, and even if you are familiar with the comics, you probably still don't know this, but it is a rift in space and time that was formed at the end of a comic run called The War of Kings in 2009, which had a lot to do with Guardians of the Galaxy. Anyways, at the end of that with the fault, that became a central focus of the comic run of Thanos in the Thanos Imperative that was written in 2010. So I believe it is pointing us to a larger villain that we will encounter. The other Easter egg is simply 616 written and circled on the chalkboard, which if you're familiar with the comics, you know that 616, 616 is the comic universe. It's basically the first Earth versus the MCU, which is, I believe, the 199,999 Earth.
Yeah, in the comics, they basically have a number for each universe to help the writers and the fans, and even sometimes the characters in the comics identify each universe from each other. And so that's just, I think 616 actually has a meaning, Zach. I can't remember what it is. It's either a year or a date or something, but that's why it was chosen for the main Marvel universe.
Now, a little later in the movie, but it still kind of fits here, we see that Darcy and her intern find out where Eric is after viewing him running around naked on TV, and they come back to break him out, and they're successfully able to do so. Now, something we haven't talked about to this point, but we jump back to Asgard, and we see that Jane Foster has a vision with this ether, and I believe this is her second or third vision to date in this movie. Is that something that is supposed to happen, or is she able to tap into its power? It wasn't really clear.
It's not clear, and it looks like this thing basically inhabits her and kind of possesses her, which is an interesting property to this specific Infinity Gem that we don't see in the others. I'm assuming that similar to how Eric Selvig said in the Avengers that the Tesseract has shown him so much stuff, that it's this Infinity Stone showing her a whole bunch of stuff.
That would make a lot of sense.
And it's also around this point that Thor decides he's going to stage a coup, and he rounds up his buddies and says, hey guys, we have to go after the Dark Elves and destroy this thing so that Jane's going to be okay.
And it's because of Odin's grief that Odin is being very harsh. And Thor, I thought, in this scene has a lot more wisdom than Odin does, who basically says, we're going to sacrifice everybody we have just to kill Malekith. And so Thor, in a very Ocean's 11 style kind of montage, gathers the Warriors 3, Sif, and breaks out Loki so that they are able to go and fight Malekith on his home world.
And Zach, I think there's a reference to the Avengers in the scene where Thor goes to Loki. If you remember in the Avengers, when Nick Fury is talking to Loki in the cell, he says, you must be desperate or something like that. And in this film, he uses a line that's either exactly the same or very similar, where he says, you must be desperate to come to me for help when he's talking to Thor.
And I believe that's true. Thor has to be desperate. Not only that, but you see that Loki is desperate as everything is kind of strewn around his room. He's like sitting in a corner, and the death of Frigga has devastated him.
And not only the death of her, but his hand in it. If he had not told Curse where to go, which stairwell to go up, she would probably still be alive. And because he had such a strong relationship with her, this has kind of broken him. And Zach, you mentioned in the Avengers that you didn't like how he was portrayed in that movie because he's never seen that way again. I think this is the reason. His mother has died and it's his fault. And so it kind of causes a change in him.
See, I would have to disagree with that. I think it is really interesting here, but my first viewing, I would agree with you. The second viewing, I thought that Loki was distraught because of her death. And I think subliminally he thinks, yes, maybe he did help cause that, even though he knows he caused it. But he's unwilling to admit that, and so he blames other people. He blames Thor for not protecting her. He blames Odin. And I believe it's earlier in the movie as well that when he's talking to Odin, Odin's like, how could you attack Earth? And he's like, it was a handful of people compared to the thousands that you have slain. And I thought that really connected at the start of the film that this Loki is different from the Avengers, and that story arc continues on now. So whether you actually think Loki is admitting that he played a hand in it, even though he did, I think the story arc still works really well. And I love the relationship between him and his brother.
I agree. It's one of the best parts of this movie. And actually, Zach, I don't know if you know this, but when Alan Taylor came in, he actually boosted Loki's role because he wasn't supposed to be in this film very much. And he loved that relationship so much that he wrote him in a lot more.
And with these Ocean 11 type scenes, I love it because you have the interspersing of Thor and the Warriors 3 talking about how they can never make this happen. And then while they're talking about it, it cuts to scenes of it actually happening. And in one of those scenes, we get another Easter egg from the Avengers.
Captain America. He comes in, and Loki basically has transformed into him to mock Thor. Now, Zach, they shot this a couple different times. There was one time where they actually shot Tom Hiddleston in that costume.
How did that look?
It looked really funny. I guess they had to make a whole new one just for him because he is not the same size as Chris Evans.
No, that's funny. And I think it's here Loki's mockery of Thor actually holds not only this scene, but kind of these extended scenes together really well.
And we didn't get to see a lot of this in that first Thor movie. A lot of it was in the deleted scenes. And I'm talking about the kind of brother relationship between Thor and Loki that normal brothers have, right? They're brothers and they fight, but they pick on each other. And that's kind of how they communicate and how they show that they love each other.
And so they're able to break out of Asgard, and through it just being Loki, Thor, and Jane Foster, they finally make their way to the home of the Dark Elves.
And Zach, one thing to note is they do this through one of Loki's ways off planet, which was referenced way back in the first Thor movie when he says there's more than one way on and off Asgard. So after they go through that portal, they do end up in the Dark World. And they basically, there's a few brief moments of grieving and fighting between them before they make it to this point where Malekith has come down and they have a confrontation.
And so it's at this point that they have some type of idea of how they're going to attack Malekith. But once Thor, who is chain Loki, releases his handcuffs, Loki takes out a knife, chops off stabs Thor, who rolls down the hill. Loki runs after him, grabs Jane Foster, chops off Thor's hand, and then throws Jane and is like, all right, here you go, Malekith. Here's the ether that you wanted. I just want to see Asgard burn. Right after that, we see that Malekith absorbs the ether into himself, taking it out of Jane Foster, and that this was all a fake out, as it was a hallucination casted by Loki as Thor gets his arm back, grabs his hammer, and tries to zap the ether and destroy it. Did this fake out get you the first time you saw this movie way back when?
Yeah, I totally fell for this. I think it's entirely in Loki's character to portray Thor like that, as we'll see again in Thor Ragnarok. And when they cut off his hand, I could not believe it, because you can see the bone in his arm. And I was like, wow, they're actually permanently changing Thor, the character, and they don't. And I think they learned that lesson because they do something similar but better in Thor Ragnarok. But I wish it would have been real, personally. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, when I watched this 7 months ago, it got me. I'm like, oh man. And I think why it played more of a role is that in the comic strain, at this point, is that Thor is actually missing his arms. That happens in the comics. Now, I can't remember if he actually regains it. Who knows? You lose appendages and gain them back again in all the comics, right? As well as your entire body. However, that had happened in the comics, even though the comic strain was written before the movie, but just how I watched the movie later. So definitely 100% believable. It got me.
And so, as you mentioned, Thor tries to destroy the ether when it comes out. And Zach, I don't know if you noticed this, but when he fails to destroy it, the ether falls as shards, as like gemstones, which is a reference, I believe, to the fact that all of the other Infinity Gems are stones.
That's right. So Thor fails, and unfortunately, Malekith is able to escape, but he leaves Curse in his wake to take out both Loki and Thor, and possibly Jane Foster if she puts up a fight.
So Loki and Curse do fight for a little bit, and then Loki grabs these grenades that we haven't mentioned, but the Dark Elves have these grenades that kind of create like a mini black hole or something, and it implodes things into it instead of exploding, which is really cool. And he is able to use it on Curse after he himself is stabbed. Now, Zach, I don't know if you thought about this, but seeing this with, more movies since, this looked a lot like the Yellow Jacket death scene that we will get in Ant-Man.
Now that you mention it, it does. I mean, it looks exactly like that death scene. I thought it was pretty cool, a nifty way to kill Curse. If you're paying attention, Loki says, "I'll see you in hell." A normal viewer will just think, oh, okay, that's a typical action movie saying. However, if you know the comics, as I already mentioned, he says, "I'll see you in hell," Hel, which is an Asgardian afterlife guarded by Hela, who we'll see in the next Thor movie, as well as in the comics. That's where Curse ends up to go kill Malekith.
And so we think that Loki is dying here because he was stabbed by Curse before he was able to take him out. And Zach, I thought that this death was very touching. I felt that it was earned. I felt that it would conclude his story arc and that it made sense. And I was disappointed when I realized that this is not a real death.
See, I wasn't disappointed with it, but they got me. I mean, they got me twice in a row within like 5 minutes. So I thought that was definitely earned by the movie. And it was a touching send-off if it was going to be his final send-off, which it wasn't. And I'm fine with that because I think he's excellent in Thor 3. It's after this apparent death of Loki that we get Thor and Jane, who are looking for a way to get back to Earth, and Jane's phone starts to ring.
Yeah, they basically stumble into a cave, which is where all of the keys and everything from those portals at the beginning of the movie led out. Zach, how did you feel about this? This seems awfully convenient that this is where everything led out, and it just lets them back in. The first time I saw this, I absolutely hated this. It frustrated me to no end. This time, maybe it's because I knew it was coming, it didn't bother me so much.
Yeah, I didn't hate it, but after this happened, I wrote in my notes, creative license.
Well, at least it does bring those portals back from the beginning, which, is better than nothing. Now, when they do go through that portal, they end up back in London.
They make their way to the home of Darcy, the intern, and Eric, who basically, through some conversation, they're able to plot some charts of all these ancient structures that were built 500,000 million trillion years ago or whatever, and find out that the final battle where Malekith will go is Greenwich, England.
Yeah, they realize that that's actually the center point of the convergence. And this is another thing that I still don't actually really go with, the way they figure this out. Somehow they decide that it is those ancient landmarks that are going to point to it, which just feels lazy, and I'm sure it was done for running time reasons, but I just don't like it.
But what we do get is a final battle where we have the scientists who are going to put down Jane Foster's silver sticks. So we have these silver sticks that, as far as I'm concerned, do a ton of magical stuff that is never necessarily explained.
They mention that they're supposed to detect the anomalies, not create them, and they're using them to create them, which, again, I am not a scientist for a living, but things that detect stuff almost always cannot create the thing they're detecting. I mean, that'd be like using a tape measure to create length. It just doesn't make sense.
But with Malekith now in Greenwich, because he has the ether in his bloodstream, he's just waiting for the convergence to all align with the 9 realms and to destroy everything, because that's who he is, and he's just a dark elf that likes to kill stuff, and that's his story arc.
Yeah, and Zach, this plays into his backstory. We see a little bit of it in this film. Basically, it's mentioned that the elves were born in the darkness, I guess before the universe was born or before there was light. It's kind of vague. And they are trying to return the universe back to that state, which obviously would be bad for all of us. But there was actually a lot of other scenes in this film that were cut out pertaining to his backstory. There was a scene where he was thinking about like his children and kids on Svartalheim, and how they were killed by a boar. And so there's stuff here that I wish had made it back into the film, and we'll talk about this more at the end with some of the fallout of the film. But this stuff that was cut out kind of upset Christopher Eccleston, because he only signed on because that character was not going to become a, quote, cackling fiend.
Now, I loved the not only idea, but the execution of this end fight scene. It's something we haven't necessarily seen before with the idea of the convergence and portals. And so during this fight scene, you have Malekith and Thor battling, and they are falling through different portals, going to the different 9 realms, and falling through different portals and returning back to Earth. So it's this very interesting fight scene, something we haven't seen before, which I appreciated. So it wasn't like a hammer swinging and punches being thrown, but something completely different. What were your thoughts?
Well, I remember them going through like several realms, and they only go through 2 or 3. There's Earth, there's the Dark World. They do visit Jotunheim, which is kind of a fun callback. And they might visit the place where Hogun's from. I don't remember if they do for sure. You see it in the sky. You do see Niflheim in the sky, actually, though, which is a place we will visit in Thor Ragnarok. It's kind of a fiery location. But the first time I saw this, Zach, I did not like this at all. I felt like it was very brawly. Like, I think I had this issue with another film where it just doesn't seem choreographed. It doesn't seem exciting. They were just punching each other and like boxers, and it just, not much was happening. And there's some things in here that slow the whole action down, where he has to get on a train, and there is some funny stuff with the hammer going up into space when he falls through a portal and then coming back to Earth and having to come back down. So there's some stuff like that in there that I had issues with. This time, I did not have nearly as many issues with it. I don't know what my issue was the first time I saw this. But I think that this was a serviceable ending. I do like the portals. I like how they're falling through them. I like the action. I do like the stuff with the hammer. I think there might be one too many jokes here. And I do think that the ultimate demise of Malekith is unearned, uninteresting, and pretty lazy, because he basically gets swallowed up by a portal and a ship falls on him. The ship falling on him really shouldn't kill him when he's wielding what we will find out later is the Reality Stone. He really should be able to rip that thing apart without doing anything, without it crushing him. So I have issues with things like that, but overall, it was a decent ending.
You're right. There are a couple of issues, but for the most part, I like the humor, there's action, and you talked about an Easter egg, which we do see. We see the Realm of Fire with Surtur, who causes Ragnarok, which we'll see in Thor number 3. We also get another Easter egg as a Jotunheim beast jumps out of one of these portals, and the last time we saw that was back in Thor number 1, when it chased the Warriors 3, Sif, Loki, and Thor off that world.
And so, as I mentioned, they do ultimately defeat Malekith, and all is well? Question mark?
That is what you think, because we then return to Asgard, where you see Odin, who isn't necessarily sitting like he usually sits, but has his arm extended and is kind of lounging back. And if you are a comic fan, you might note right away that this is a posture that Loki has often in the comic books. It's a very Loki fashion stylized sitting or lounging, and it is revealed after an encounter with Thor and Odin, quotation marks, where Thor basically says, I need to defend the realms, I'm not ready to be king, and he leaves, that Loki has been casting a spell and is Odin, and Odin is nowhere to be found.
Zach, I have a couple questions here. 1. What if Thor had said yes, he wants the throne? What would Loki have done?
Well, I think Loki is a magnificent trickster, and he would have come up with another way around that. So I don't see that necessarily as an issue, other than as Loki knowing how to play Thor.
All right. Well, I guess I can go with that. But I do want to mention here, I mentioned in our last podcast, or maybe it was Avengers, I don't remember. We do a lot of these things. That my issue is Marvel will set up this crazy thing at the end of a movie and ignore it in the next movie. They did that here with the Bifrost. They're going to do it again in Thor Ragnarok with this whole Loki being Odin thing. I thought this setup was such a rich possibility of storytelling things and ideas and things that could happen. And they just throw it away and they make a joke of it. And part of it's because that movie goes in a completely different direction. But I'm saddened by that. And I wish we would have got to see this play out more in future MCU movies.
You see, I think it works fine in the next movie just because the next movie is more of a comedy than a superhero movie, which is what I think what was needed in the Thor franchise to reinvigorate it. But I digress. Now, it's after this scene that we get a couple end credit scenes. The first of those being an important one with the Collector.
Yes, this is our first in-film confirmation that the Tesseract is indeed an Infinity Stone, and that likewise the Ether is an Infinity Stone. And it sees Volstagg and Sif travel to the Collector, which Zach, up until this point, we hadn't seen. But that's a character that would later appear in Guardians of the Galaxy, which they were shooting at the same time. And they give him the Ether because it is too dangerous to keep two Infinity Stones so close together.
That's right. And it's after this that you hear the Collector state 1 down, 5 left to go, indicating that there are 6 Infinity Gems in the Marvel Universe. So far, the 2 gems that we have found the Space Gem, which is located inside the Tesseract, which is currently sitting in Asgard, and the Reality Gem, which is the Ether, and which is now sitting in the Collector's Museum. So we have 4 more to go, which in the comics, once those stones are collected and put inside of the Infinity Gauntlet, makes anybody who is wearing that gauntlet pretty much unstoppable.
And Zach, in addition to those, we also have the one inside of Loki's scepter, but I do not believe we knew that for sure at this point. I think that's something that they confirm in Age of Ultron.
And how I see that Infinity Stone, while it is in his scepter, I currently just see it as in the Vision's head. Now, the other end credit scene is, again, more of a interesting, funny scene. The first of that is that Thor and Jane are reunited after Jane has been sitting at her table for who knows how long. And the second part of that is we see the Jotunheim beast parading around chasing birds in England. Now, Caleb, I do have a question of this end credit scene. We have Thor and Jane embracing, indicating that they're going to be a couple in the next Thor movie, or at least the next Avengers movie. However, this end credit scene doesn't pay off whatsoever, as one of those actors never returns to the MCU. If that was the case, why include this end credit scene?
Well, Zach, I don't think that was the plan at the time. Similarly to how Norton was supposed to be in the Avengers originally, they were supposed to bring this character back in future films. They weren't planning on completely dumping her. That's something that came about when they talked about other directors and potentially with some behind the scenes things that happened with this film. So I think it's completely valid. But there is an Easter egg, I guess you could call it an Easter egg, an interesting trivia point about this scene, Zach. Do you have any idea what I'm talking about?
The annoying level of Darcy.
No,
Oh.
That's not at all what I'm talking about. When Jane goes outside to kiss Thor, we never see her face. It's because that is not Natalie Portman.
Really?
Really. This is actually Chris Hemsworth's wife. And some actors will not kiss other actresses. That is not the reason that she is here doing this. Basically, they were doing reshoots, and this was added at that point. They could not get Natalie Portman back to do the scene. And so Chris Hemsworth's wife is basically the same build, similar hair color, and so they just did her up in that costume and had her go and kiss him, which is also why that kiss is particularly passionate.
Very interesting. That's awesome. And so that end credit scene wraps up our movie. So how did this movie do both critically and commercially, domestically and overseas?
Well, Zach, this movie was released November 8th of 2013, and it had a budget of $170 million, and its worldwide gross was $644.5 million. So it definitely made a profit, but it did not do so well critically.
So it made a lot of money. I mean, it surpassed the growth of Thor in only 19 days. That's incredible.
That's true, it did, and a lot of that can be credited to the Avengers and the success of that movie. But Zach, when you compare that to the returns of Marvel's other movies, it's not great. It's in the lower end of the returns. When you compare it to Phase 1, it's about middle of the road, so I guess at this point, it's okay. But the critical response is not very good at all. Its Rotten Tomatoes score is currently sitting at 66%, and Metacritic sitting at 54 points. This is the lowest reviewed Marvel movie out of all of them. In fact, it didn't even win any awards. Most of the other Marvel films have won awards either for acting or special effects or something of that nature. This one was nominated for 17 and didn't take one of them.
And this is a huge reason why I didn't actually see it when it came out. I remember that nobody necessarily liked it. The reviews with the general audience were bad. The reviews with those in geekdom were bad. It was just negative all around. And so I'm still a Marvel fanboy. I'll still go watch it. I was just putting it off until a little later, and I never got around to watching it.
And Zach, I think that's the legacy of this film. It tainted, I think, Marvel's image in the public perception. Regardless of what me and you think, people at the time and still now do not have a very high opinion of this movie, and it made people think that they might have lost their magic. Marvel had.
And not only did it make a lot of people in the audience unhappy, but a lot of those that were in the inner workings of the movie were unhappy, starting with Alan Taylor.
Yeah, so when Alan came in, he decided to do the film because he was going to get some free reign and do what he wanted, which was, great. That's what we all want Marvel movies to be, because if they're all the same, we get tired of them, right? And so he mentioned and said that while he was shooting the movie, Marvel pretty much let him have free reign to do whatever he wanted. But once he got in the editing room, it became an entirely different movie as Marvel took over what could and could not be in the film.
Which I think is something they changed for Thor 3, but that's really interesting insight of the creative process and how they kind of restrained Alan Taylor.
Another one that had issues, as you mentioned up top, Zach, is Natalie Portman. Now, she was not very sure that she wanted to come back to this movie at all. And the only reason that she kind of agreed was because she was contractually obligated to, but also because Patty Jenkins was attached when she came back on. And she was a big fan of Patty Jenkins.
That's right. And it was after Patty Jenkins left, was fired, that Natalie Portman actually wanted to back out. And again, as you stated, Caleb, she couldn't because she was contractually obligated and had to stay. But I don't think her heart was necessarily in the portrayal of Jane Foster in this movie.
That's exactly right. I'm not sure that I have so much of an issue with her in her portrayal in this film. It is far better than her portrayal in the Star Wars prequels, where she had phoned it in and was purposely trying not to act.
True.
But that is probably part of the reason she does not return in the future. Now, another person that had issues, a lot of people having issues with this film, Christopher Eccleston. As we mentioned, he came on only because Alan Taylor convinced him that this villain would be interesting. He didn't want to be that cackling fiend that shows up, has no motivations, and gets defeated.
So first Mickey Rourke in Iron Man 2, and now Christopher Eccleston in Thor 2.
Yes, it's an ongoing trend. That's not great. And so he was very upset when most of his scenes were cut. Now, personally, I attribute that to the Marvel side, if you believe what Alan Taylor says, in that they kind of took over editing of the film and decided what could and couldn't be. There's other remarks from other directors that seem to back that up with where Marvel was headed at this point. Joss Whedon actually has some similar complaints with Avengers Age of Ultron, but I think it's something that Marvel learned a lesson from. And Zach, I'm not sure if you saw this, but just a day or two ago, Marvel released a photo with a whole bunch of people from the first 10 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In it, I was surprised to see Alan Taylor was there.
Yeah, I did see that photo, and there were a couple of people I didn't know who they were, so that's interesting that Alan Taylor was in that photo.
Yeah, I saw him specifically. I wanted to see if he was there. But notably absent was Natalie Portman, Christopher Eccleston, and Mickey Rourke.
Ah, so I see that their hatred still abounds. And I'm assuming that Edward Norton also didn't show up?
Edward Norton was not there, but Louis Leterrier, who directed that film, was.
Now we also get our final one-shot called All Hail the King. And not only is this the final one-shot, but it is also the longest one-shot at, I believe, a running time of around 12 or 13 minutes.
And you mentioned this in our Iron Man 3 episode. This one-shot kind of revolves around Trevor Slattery, the character that was playing the Mandarin in Iron Man 3. He's in jail. Specifically, he is in Seagate Prison. Now, Zach, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but this is where in the comics and in the Netflix show, Luke Cage gets locked up and gets his powers.
Exactly.
So he's in here, and we get some funny scenes with him coming back and doing the voice for the people. And he has kind of become a celebrity in the prison. And he is so self-absorbed with that celebrity that he doesn't care that he's in prison. He doesn't care that he was a terrorist. He has no issues with that. So he's very happy.
Yeah, and I attribute that to Ben Kingsley's acting. It is just phenomenal here.
And let's just talk about how amazing it is that they got back this level of actor for a one-shot.
Yeah, that is incredible.
So this entire thing is framed kind of as an interview. And this guy's coming in. And when I saw this for the first time, I didn't recognize the guy that's interviewing him. But he's actually in one of my favorite shows now, a show called Halt and Catch Fire, which was actually canceled recently. It went for 4 seasons. But this guy is phenomenal. I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but everything he's in is great. And so he's coming in and he's talking to Trevor about what he's done. Right, Zach?
That's right. And it makes it very clear that what Trevor Slattery has done is taken the name of the Mandarin and has somehow abused it, indicating that there technically is another Mandarin out there. And I think the culmination of that is that this reporter kind of he's filming the whole thing. He pops out a gun that was in the camera and takes out all the guards, including Trevor Slattery's prison bodyguard. And then when he points the gun at Trevor Slattery, you see that he has a 10 rings tattoo on his arm.
Yes, and he says that basically the real Mandarin is upset with him, and he is taking Trevor so the real Mandarin can kill him. Now, Zach, this basically retcons the fact that the Mandarin doesn't really exist in this universe, or that he was Killian. How do you feel about Marvel going back on something so large as this?
Well, as I said in our Iron Man 3 podcast, I think they did this to wash clean of their sins because of that movie. Now, I thought a funny aspect of that was that during the filming of this, we have Trevor Slattery sitting there and he's telling the reporter, he's like, we've gotten so much backlash. Have you even seen the message boards? And the interviewer's like, no, I'm not talking about that. But it was obvious that in this little scene, what they were talking about was the backlash they got from comic book fans of how they handled the Mandarin in Iron Man 3. And so I think this is just a way of them to wipe the slate clean, basically apologize and say, no, there is a Mandarin in the MCU. We will probably never see him, but we hear you.
Zach, that's funny. I never noticed that. And I remember them talking about this at the time, that it was always their intention that there was a real Mandarin out in the world when Iron Man 3 came out. And I feel like that's not really true. I feel like they did backpedal for this one shot. But either way, it is kind of nice to see that there's a real one out there, but also kind of a shame knowing we will never see him.
And it's in this one shot we're also introduced to a character that we haven't seen since Iron Man 2.
That's right. Justin Hammer. And this is actually the most recent time we've seen that character.
He makes some funny quips, and he kind of wraps up the one shot, which I thought was a very well done one shot for Marvel.
It has very high production values, and I wish that they would continue to do these in the future.
So Caleb, we have talked about what happened in the production of Thor: The Dark World and after the release of the movie, as well as reviewing the movie itself. So how does this line up in your current ranking of Marvel movies?
Well, Zach, I talked about at the top of this episode that my memory of this film was that it was one of Marvel's worst, and that I never wanted to revisit it. And in fact, that was my wife's thought as well. Watching it this time, I don't think that holds true at all. I think that maybe we were still coming off of the Avengers and we were expecting too much. I think this film does have some issues. Malekith, I think he's probably Marvel's worst villain up to this point. We'd had Ironmonger, the Abomination, Whiplash and Justin Hammer, Loki, Red Skull, and then Killian. And out of all of them, pretty much all of them at least have some kind of motivation. Probably the weakest of those that I mentioned would be Ironmonger. And Malekith just doesn't stack up. I think he had the potential to be something really interesting, something ancient, something that we feared, and somewhere along the way, that just kind of got messed up. I do really love the Lord of the Rings meets Star Wars meets Ocean's 11 meets Star Trek sort of feel of this movie. I do like Ragnarok, don't get me wrong. We'll talk about that in a few weeks from now. But I wish they would have kept this tone and continued it, because I feel like this expanded on so much of that first Thor movie, and I think you could do a whole lot with this tone. You could do some very interesting dramatic storylines and things, and I'm sad to see it go. But overall, I did like this movie, Zach. There are some things at the end maybe you could cut out, but you know, I guess I just keep saying this because I'm surprised how much I ended up liking this film. I expected this to be at the very bottom of my list. So last week, my rankings were number 1, The Avengers. Number 2, Iron Man. Number 3, Thor. Number 4, Captain America, the First Avenger. Number 5, The Incredible Hulk. Number 6, Iron Man 3. And number 7, Iron Man 2. And we talked about how Iron Man 2 and 3 were at the bottom of my list. And I was thinking Thor 2 was going to join them. Maybe just Marvel wasn't great at doing sequels. But you know what? That is not the case. I think that this movie is more entertaining than Iron Man 2. I think it drags less than Captain America the First Avenger. I think that it expands on the world more than The Incredible Hulk and Iron Man 3. And I think that it just kind of sums up the state of Marvel at the time. Is it as great as the Avengers or Iron Man? No. Is it as good as the first Thor? Probably not. I wish that you could kind of take some of the first Thor and combine it with some of the elements of this one and mash them together, and that would be a very great Thor movie. But they didn't. So, where is this going? I am sandwiching it in between Thor and Captain America on my list, which means this is higher than Captain America, Hulk, Iron Man 2 and 3, but lower than the Avengers, Iron Man, and Thor. Which brings my final list to the Avengers number 1, Iron Man number 2, Thor number 3, Thor The Dark World number 4, Captain America the First Avenger 5, The Incredible Hulk 6, Iron Man 3 7, and Iron Man 2 8.
So when I look at my list, I have to decide where this movie falls. And Caleb, the reason I waited until 7 months ago to watch Thor the Dark World is because of all the negative publicity and everything I heard about the movie. So when I watched this a second time, I was worried because I enjoyed this movie when I watched it 7 months ago. And I was worried that I enjoyed it because I went in with such low expectations. And so this time watching it again, coming off all those Marvel movies, I cleared my expectations and just watched it as a movie. And I would say that Thor the Dark World is a fantastic action movie. Is it a fabulous movie in general? No. Is it a really bad movie? No. But as far as action movies go, it's just a great movie to sit down. I thought that the fight scenes were done really well. Loki and Thor's relationship paid off, and I loved their two different story arcs and their quips between them. This movie had a ton of Easter eggs. The fake outs were great. There was a lot of action. It moved fast. The transitioned really well. Even, I complained in Thor number 1 that I hated Darcy. In this one, her humor is actually somewhat funny. So she's progressing as a character. So I even like that. If I would have to say some of the downfalls, the only one I can really think of is, as you stated, Malekith. But I don't even think that was that bad of a low point. He's a dark elf. Dark elves in fantasy are usually evil. To me, because of this kind of Lord of the Rings-esque style and how they portrayed the movie, he didn't need a big backstory to be an evil bad guy. We've seen those evil characters in other movies in the MCU that haven't had that backstory then have been okay. So for me, Malekith was okay. It was really interesting to see Curse and some of the other villains in here. So, saying all that, my list last week was Avengers number 1, Iron Man number 2, Captain America number 3, Thor number 4, Iron Man 2 number 5, Incredible Hulk number 6, and the bottom of my list is Iron Man 3 as number 7. Now I think Thor number 2 is incredibly better than Iron Man 3. Anything's better than Iron Man 3. I think it connects to the MCU more and just a better movie than The Incredible Hulk. I think it flows better, transitions better, the action's better than Iron Man 2. And so really where I struggled is comparing it with the first Thor. And unlike yourself, I put it above Thor. I like this movie better than Thor. Now, is it, that much higher than Thor? No, just a small tidbit higher. But for me, it's less, fake. It feels more real. There's more content to it. The relationship with Loki and Thor is more established. Darcy's less annoying. Jane Foster's relationship with Thor is more established. And so it has, I think, a lot of better elements. And specifically, the villain's better. Not Loki, but the Destroyer. We don't get this one and done fight scene. We get a long, extended, great fight scene with some humor in it. So my new list of movies is this. Avengers number 1, Iron Man number 2, Captain America number 3, and now Thor the Dark World is my number 4, meaning my bottom 4 would be Thor's number 5, Iron Man 2's number 6, The Incredible Hulk 7, and Iron Man 3 number 8. And Caleb, I think if I could say, if you're a listener and you're taking one thing away from where Caleb and I have placed Thor number 2 in our list of movies, is this. Go back and rewatch Thor the Dark World. Even if you hated it the first time, in light of our podcasts and light of rewatching the MCU movies, if you're doing that, go back and watch it, and I promise you that you will enjoy it more than you did the first time you watched it.
Yeah, and Zach, it's interesting. You placed yours at number 4, and I placed mine at number 4 as well. Even though we have different movies surrounding it, it's in the same spot, kind of middle of the road.
That's right. I would agree. It's that middle of the road movie, and I would highly suggest you go check it out once more.
All right, Zach. Well, it's that time again. Before we go, we do want to say thank you to Taylor Poole for our amazing intro music. As always, he does great work, and we want you to check him out. You can find him at taylorpoolemusic.com. That's TaylorPoole music.com.
And a new one for us, we want to give a quick shout out to our friends over at CNC Power Hour. If you enjoy Magic the Gathering or video games, we would highly encourage you to check out their Facebook page or Twitch stream at CNC Power Hour. That's C, letter N, C, Power Hour.
They stream every Sunday at 4 o'clock.
Thanks for listening to 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Thor, The Dark World. We would love to hear your comments or feedback at cuzwerenerds@gmail.com. That's CUZWERENERDS@gmail.com. Or leave us a review or comment on iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or any major social network or podcasting sites. Join us next week as we discuss Captain America: Winter Soldier. After the monetary success but critical disappointments of Iron Man 3 and Thor 2, how does the second solo installment of Captain America hold up? Does S.H.I.E.L.D. having a major role in this movie help or hurt the film? And could this movie possibly hit our number 1 spot in our Marvel movie rankings? Find out the answer to these questions and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Captain America: Winter Soldier. Stay nerdy. My list last week was Avengers number 1, Iron Man number 2. Oh, no, I'm reading off your list. Let me state that again.
Wait, why do you have my list on there?
I wanted to compare lists and see where you have fallen from the light side into the dark side.
But that was going to give away my location. I knew I shouldn't have put it there.
So my list of movies, not Caleb's,